why is there such hostility to religion, since you talked about that, in particular the Christian religion? Are we that much of a threat that they are willing to wage war against Christianity?
Yes, there really is an assault on Christianity going on. Now, I say this as a Jewish person that Christianity, as it is known in the United States today, is the greatest force for freedom in the world. And it's because Christianity is tolerant and because Christianity has been so emphatic about the inherent dignity of individual human life that we have the kind of religious tolerance and pluralism and freedom that we have in this country. And there really has been an attack on the Christian faith in recent years. And again, it comes back to where we are in terms of these riots and violence in the streets. The civil rights movement, which some of the protesters would like to emulate, was successful precisely because it was driven by the church. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor, and many of the leaders of the civil rights movement were pastors. And Dr. King appealed to the common Christian faith that is shared by most Americans to recognize the inherent dignity of people regardless of race. And that's how he was able to get white people in particular to see that segregation was an evil, was a sin against God. And that's a crucial part of the success of the civil rights movement. Now you have this movement which is attacking history and attacking religious institutions. They vandalized synagogues, churches, they vandalized Catholic churches, they vandalized Protestant churches. They're all forms of authority and any distinction between right or wrong. By the way, that's why I really liked what the president did when he stood in front of the Bible, excuse me, stood in front of the church and held up a Bible. And he was reminding Americans that at the very base of our republic, the very foundation, is a belief in right and wrong, that there's good on one side and evil on the other. And that is the lesson of the Bible. Now, that might not necessarily be your particular Bible. You might be Muslim and you might read the Quran, you might be Hindu and read the Bhagavad Gita, but all faiths can recognize a distinction between good and evil, and that's the fundamental principle on which our republic is based. Even though we have freedom of religion, and the First Amendment says there's no official church in the United States, the virtue that the founding fathers relied on in giving Americans these freedoms, or at least recognizing these freedoms, because the freedoms aren't given by government, they're given by God, but
Mhm.
they recognized that you needed a virtuous citizenry to handle that freedom, to be responsible about that freedom. And so they took that very seriously. And Trump was reminding the country there's a right and there's a wrong. And burning a church is the definition of evil. And the media refused to see it. The Democrats refused to see it. They said, oh, it's just a photo op. Well, if it was just a photo op, that by itself is the most important photo op we've seen since George W. Bush stood on the rubble after 9/11 and told Americans we weren't going to take this anymore. I mean, in both instances, you're talking about a country having been attacked and returning to faith. And I think that faith is under attack. You're seeing it also in threats to religious symbols and so forth. But I think that in many ways, what you're seeing among these young people who are joining these protests and these riots is the absence of faith. They've missed out on the opportunity to have faith in their lives. They've missed out on the spiritual fulfillment that other Americans have enjoyed. It's not an economic poverty. In many cases, it's a spiritual poverty. And when you have something that can fill your life in a spiritual sense, you can find meaning in other kinds of struggle. All of us, people of faith, we struggle on a moral level every day. Even the best among us will struggle. That's a meaningful struggle. That's a struggle that is ennobling. That's a struggle that contributes to the welfare of those around us. And the struggle they are engaged in is, in a way, a substitute for that. What's also interesting to me is that the churches and other houses of worship have largely been closed in many of these liberal states and cities during the coronavirus pandemic. And I wonder whether the protests after George Floyd was killed would have been more nonviolent, would have been less destructive if the churches were open, because then you would have seen religious leaders able to lead some of those protests and to direct some of that outrage in a more positive way, rather than not having any ability to gather in a religious fellowship and to appeal to God and to organize under the leadership of pastors and priests and so forth. So I think that there really is a spiritual consequence, that political consequence of a spiritual absence. And that's why I think that Americans should really return to faith in a productive way, in a tolerant way. We can do it. And I think that's why the president holding that Bible was so significant.
Wow.